on our technology.
We're good. Good morning. Why don't we start this press conference, which I have before legislative meetings, and tomorrow, June 6th, the council will have a legislative meeting. It'll be our regular legislative meeting for the month of June. Tomorrow's meeting will be preceded by an additional meeting of the committee of the whole. The purpose of the committee of the whole meeting is really to just agendize measures that have come out of other committees. I don't think there's anything controversial in what's coming out of other committees. Confirmations of a couple of appointments to the Homeland Security Commission, license plates, special license plates for Washington Wizards and Pride. This is Pride Month. A revenue bond measure is coming out of the Committee on Business and Economic Development, a couple of revenue bond measures, and several measures from the Committee on Health. That will be starting at 11. And as I said, I don't think there's anything controversial there. All those measures are expected to be put on the consent agenda. So tomorrow is the regular legislative meeting for the month of June. And that means that there are a number of measures that will be on the agenda by right. Kind of looking at the agenda quickly, this is on consent. I'm not quite sure why, but there will be 7 contracts from DCPS that are being submitted to us for retroactive approval. I believe you all are aware of the continuing hearings that the Committee as a whole has held on the procurement process at DCPS and the fact that it has been a flagrant violation of legal requirements. There are 36 contracts to go back to 2020 that are over $1 million that were never submitted to the council and would not have been submitted to the council except for a Committee of the whole hearing in February about food service contracts. Food service has always been controversial because members are concerned that the quality of the food being served to our students, while it might meet nutritional requirements like eating vitamin enhanced cardboard, but really not very tasty. And so we had a hearing on those contracts and why they hadn't come over. And in preparation for the hearing, we realized there were many other contracts that had not come over. There are 36 contracts that have been identified. Of the 36, 11 are for this fiscal year. That means there are 25 from previous fiscal years that have come and gone. And of the 11, 4 have already been approved and the other 7 are on the agenda. If it had not been for intervention from higher ups in the executive branch, the school system would not have been able to get the last 3 to us, which they did on Friday. So I'm going to have to ask the council to waive the rule, the filing deadline, because those should have been filed on Wednesday, which at the hearing last week, the chancellor promised would be done. I subsequently said to him I would put them on the agenda if we got them on Thursday. He promised we would get them on Thursday. That did not happen. And as I said, there was intervention from his superiors to get those contracts to us on Friday. So I will, because those vendors have been providing services, the goods and services, the government has an obligation to pay, and no payments have been made because the contracts have not been approved. I think everybody in the executive branch who's dealing with this is embarrassed. The fact that payments were made until we pointed out that these were payments made on contracts that had not been approved. And some of these contracts, like the food service contracts, really are significant in terms of the quality of what's being provided to students. In any event, those 7 contracts will be on the agenda for tomorrow. On the non-consent agenda, I ordinarily do not point out temporary bills, but the Comprehensive Policing and Justice Reform Temporary Amendment Act is again on the agenda for final reading. On the temporary will probably be postponed. This bill accompanied an emergency that we adopted several months ago, which was a stopgap. The only, I shouldn't say stopgap, a gap filler uh, between the law, which has been enacted since 2020, and the permanent, which was undergoing congressional review, and that the Republicans had introduced a resolution to disapprove it. Then that's why I'm bringing this up, because the House did disapprove the permanent legislation. The Senate did not act in time. The Senate, I believe 3 weeks after the law became law, after the 60-day review, the Senate passed a resolution purporting to disapprove of the legislation, which was false, and then sent that to the president, who vetoed it. And the House has scheduled an override for this Wednesday. I think this Wednesday, maybe it's next week. They've scheduled an override. The performance is silly in my view. The law is quite clear, could not be clearer, that the clock ran out, and Congress doesn't have the ability through its resolutions to be able to extend the clock, nor is it in the interest of good government to just be willy-nilly setting deadlines and ignoring deadlines and then pretending the deadlines don't exist and coming up with parliamentary rulings, which I'll just note don't have the same effect as law, to say that they can still act on this. The vote in the House to disapprove 2 months ago was a majority, but not 2/3. So I'm guessing that they won't get to 2/3 in the House, but they shouldn't even be dealing with this. As I said before, it's silly because the clock's run out. Nor is it good government, as I already said, in terms of their attitude toward their own laws and deadlines. But also, this is about police accountability. And if Congress wants to take the place of the council and the mayor in terms of police accountability, then they should just go full throttle into it and be responsible for all aspects of public safety and crime, et cetera, et cetera. Not that I want them to. I don't really think that members of Congress from Alaska and Wyoming understand the district very well, but this piecemeal attitude is very harmful, whatever the jurisdiction, in this case, us. There will be, we will revisit the issue of rent increases and capping rent increases at tomorrow's meeting. As I stand here, I'm not quite sure what's been worked out. There was a bill introduced by Councilmember White that had substantial support. There was an amendment that was moved by Councilmember Pinto. Councilmember Pinto, in response to Councilmember Fruman, was willing to accept a modification to her amendment that ended up taking longer as a matter of drafting than I ever could have imagined. So it was postponed till tomorrow. I'm hopeful that everybody's been talking and worked things out so that it will be approved fairly quickly tomorrow. This the law has allowed that landlords in rent control buildings can increase rents by the amount of inflation plus 2%. Last year, inflation was extraordinarily high. I don't think it's been that high in decades. And rather than going forward with, I believe it was an 8.9% increase, there was a desire to limit that. And the proposal was to limit it, I think, to 6.9%. Councilmember Pinto, I think, was at 6% with a cap over 2 years. So it kind of evens things out. And we will see how that turns out tomorrow. I think that's the only other controversial matter on the agenda, but I'm happy to take questions on any measure as well as anything else. If I don't like the question, I won't answer it. Yes.
You didn't mention the other amendment that will also be considered. Can you explain, which of those?
About on rent control?
Yes, sir. By Councilmember Nadeau and Janice Lewis George.
Yes.
Which of those three? It seems like there's really 3 proposals, 2 of them being amendments. Do you support? And after last week's council meeting that, got a little bit out of hand, how do you intend to kind of keep things under control this time?
Well, things got out of hand last week because I never imagined that it would take a half an hour to draft a sentence. Um, I was last week supportive of Councilmember Robert White's proposal. And given the amendments and comments from members with regard to the amendments, I'm hopeful that things have been worked out. I will have to make some phone calls this afternoon, but what I'm hopeful is that when it comes up, because when it comes up tomorrow, it comes up exactly as it was when it was postponed, which means Councilmember Pinto with the oral amendment is pending. I'm hopeful that that will be withdrawn and a revised amendment will be submitted that everybody agrees with.
Being the adjustment with Councilmember Freeman's modification,
They're all
when you say
pretty close. I think
revised.
that Councilmember Lewis George was a percentage point or two lower than where the Pinto amendment with Councilmember Freeman was going with 2 years. They were pretty close, so we'll see how they work it out. It's Mr. Collins.
Okay, so as far as, oh, wow, okay. What inspired or what was going through your mind when you let Councilmember Pinto's amendment go up first and not Councilmember Lewis George, Parker's and Nadeau's, you know, especially considering the fact that it did take 30 minutes for her to reshape it a bit. And, you know, I'm just trying to get clarity around that, you know, what's the precedence of doing something like that, or what was going through your mind at that time?
Well, I think people are trying to read more into it than there is to be read. I recognized Councilmember Pinto first on the declaration. I recognized her first on the bill. You know, I've been around long enough to know that whether somebody comes first or second doesn't make that much difference. And as I said earlier in the meeting last week, and I've said previously, and I've said since, as a presiding officer, I'm going to follow the order in which I recognize folks, not necessarily the order that amendments are written on the agenda. You know, people don't get to come first just because they file first.
So is there a protocol around that, or it, you know, is
What I just said.
so it's just based?
And it's the same thing with recognizing folks. So that's just the chairman's prerogative. But yeah, I want to emphasize again that I saw Councilmember Pinto first, which is why I recognized her.
You didn't mention the BSA. Is that still coming up tomorrow?
No, the BSA is not on the agenda tomorrow. It'll be next Tuesday. And I'm doing my best to keep it as the only item on next Tuesday's agenda.
Any particular reason for that? Things you needed to work out for the delay? Because I thought it was going to be this week.
Yeah, I was surprised that staff thought we could do it this week. And, but I had a meeting with staff on Thursday. We were still getting language and suggestions from members, and there was not time to vet it. People don't realize how much is involved with the BSA. The BSA is unlike other legislation in that it does not have a detailed report with background and need that discusses for several pages the reason for the particular each subtitle. I mean, each subtitle is like an individual act. And so therefore there's a lot more work that's done by staff with what goes into the BSA. I could put it differently. So an amendment that is proposed by a member or a rewrite that's proposed by a member, it goes to my staff, it goes to the Budget Council, it goes to the General Counsel, it goes to the Office of Revenue Analysis. Everybody gives edits, gives a report or response. Things have to get worked out. That's very time consuming. So I indicated to members last Thursday that this would be scheduled for next Tuesday. If I had not done that, then measures that we were getting on Friday would have today to go through that vetting process, which is not enough for a 200-page bill.
one of the concerns that I've been hearing about the BSA from the Commission on Arts and Humanities folks, I think Reggie Van Lee even wrote a letter saying that they were worried about the provisions changing how capital funding is allocated, that it would once again advantage, large organizations over smaller ones. I'm curious if you had spoken with him about this. I understand some council members are working with you on changes, and I'm curious where that process stands.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised by that. I met with the chairman of the commission and the new executive director several weeks ago about the proposal. But in any event, I'm meeting with them again this week. I know that part of their concern has to do with nominees that are pending before the council. I met with the mayor's appointments person 2 months ago and said, in so many words, you screwed up the terms for one of the members because they're staggered. You screwed up the term, and you need to clarify which member has I think it's a shorter or longer term. And we are still waiting for that. And we've followed up with that office numerous times. I have nothing against any of the nominees, but we need to sort out what the terms are for them, and then we'll have a hearing. And it's on them that that's taken so long. I am concerned that there's a quorum issue. Although I think as I'm standing here, I think those members are allowed to hold over. So that might be exaggerated.
I'm curious what prompted the decision to put the funding changes into the BSA in the first place about capital funding. I think it restricts like what percentage of an organization's funding can come from commission grants. Like, what was the rationale behind
Well, those
it?
are two different issues.
Okay.
So let's take the restriction on how much an organization, in my view, should not be so dependent on the government that over 50% of its budget is coming from the government. I mean, I just think that's good grantsmanship. And an organization that is that dependent not only is at risk in a downturn of basically being put out of business because they're essentially being run by the government, not run, but funded by the government, if a majority of their funding comes from the government. But an organization like that needs to develop capacity, build capacity for fundraising. The Arts Commission is meant to nurture organizations, large and small. So organizations need capacity building, need the capacity, and they need to demonstrate that. So more than 50% of their budget is not good grantsmanship. With regard to the capital grants, the council continues to get requests from organizations for large capital grants. And the commission, because of the way we restructured their grant making a couple of years ago, has not been able to do that, is not able to do that. So we've created this new large grant category. In years past, the council has given large grants to organizations. I'm thinking, for instance, Studio Theater was $7.5 million. This was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. That's what I mean by large grants. And we continue to get those requests. And in my view, since we now have a dedicated funding stream for the arts on a per capita basis, maybe 3 times greater than the next state in terms of how generous we are to the arts, then we don't need to be then adding on top of that outside the Arts Commission with grants. So all of this should go through the commission, and the commission has the expertise for evaluating the quality of arts programs. I don't know if they do that, but they should be evaluating the quality of the arts programs. And as I said to the chair of the commission, equity is important, and they can use these large capital grants to impose equity requirements like the membership of their board, or partnering with a smaller organization, or what kind of I want to say BIPOC participation there is in the programming, a lot of different ways to promote equity as a condition for these large capital grants.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Collins.
When do you anticipate hosting that hearing about charter transparency? And I'm just referring back to last week's legislative meeting about the salaries and publishing them. You said it was more appropriate to have the discussion at a hearing. When do you anticipate moving forward with that?
I'm trying to remember. I think that was in the context of the probability of legislation being introduced. And then we would have a hearing around that legislation. If legislation isn't introduced, then I'm going to have to think through the structure of an oversight hearing. We have a few oversight hearings that are coming out of the budget debate with regard to schools, such as school security, which I want to have, probably more hearings on contracting, a hearing to make sure that the budgeting for the individual schools is on track. As you know, we put about $27 million into schools, individual schools, rather than central administration. And I want to make sure that that's being implemented with fidelity. So this would all fit into that schedule.
What apprehension, if any, do you have against charters publishing salaries?
Gosh, I don't remember if I spoke to this last week, so I don't know if I'm repeating myself. This was talked about as a proposal for last week. As I recall, there was an amendment moved and then withdrawn. One of the arguments that I would have made is that doing it through the Budget Support Act would have been very sudden without there being more of a hearing and without there being a full understanding of what this involves with regard to individual teachers in the charter sector. So let me kind of put this in some context. Anyone who comes to work for the government knows or should know that their salary is going to be a matter of public record, but that's not the case in the private sector, and the charters are nonprofits. They're not actually government schools. And so there isn't that expectation. And if we're going to go there, then how do we transition there? If there's concerns, what are the concerns and why are there the concerns? And how do we deal with the concerns? So without that kind of discussion, it's not appropriate to just simply legislate that that's the law beginning tomorrow.
And going back to the rent control situation last week, has there been any conversation with Councilmember Lewis George about what transpired, or is there anything to have a conversation about as far as what happened?
Oh, she's on my call list for today.
Thank you.
Any other questions regarding tomorrow? Yes.
There's a medical cannabis bill on the schedule as well. Do you expect any significant debate around that or significant practical impact, how it works now?
I don't. This is coming from Councilmember McDuffie, and I need a full briefing on it this afternoon. But my understanding is that it's fairly technical, sort of clarifying. It deals with the manufacturing side, which is actually not what I like to call it, the cultivating side. And there's a challenge in that we've been trying to remove barriers to increasing demand for medical cannabis. And as demand increases, the supply, which is required to be locally grown, has not been keeping pace. And so this addresses that tension. I will add this. The medical cannabis market in the district is controlled because we're able to regulate it, unlike the recreational market. And as a result, there is assurance of quality. The product has to be grown in the city, has to be grown by licensed cultivators. There is, I believe we call it seed to sale tracking. These are qualities that do not exist right now in the unregulated recreational market, which is a reason why the unregulated recreational market is in some ways dangerous. Dangerous might seem too strong a word, but consumers do not know that what they're purchasing on the recreational side is what they think they're purchasing. And so I know that when there have been tests that the tests have indicated that basically there's a lot of fraud going on with regard to what's being sold. The identification of what's being sold. And that doesn't exist on the medical side. So this emergency is addressing the cultivating and trying to remove barriers to increasing the supply.
Is that when you say remove barriers, reducing the regulations or?
Yeah, the medical cannabis came out of a 2010 law that was rewriting the initiative from the 1990s when Congress finally lifted that rider. And in 2010, I don't know if there were any jurisdictions in the country that had legalized recreational. And so we were trying to tightly regulate and limit cannabis so that there wasn't cheating, so to speak. And it's a very different world today. So it used to be that cultivators couldn't cultivate more than, I think it was maybe 100 plants. And well, that limits supply. And why do we need to have that limitation? That's just for example.
And then just to follow up real quick, you mentioned fraud going on with the identification of what's being sold. Is this the DC government that has run tests, or what is the evidence coming from for the fraud?
I wouldn't say the DC government. I don't know of that, but I know that where I've gotten reports of testing that what's being sold and what's being sold and what's being described as being sold are two different things.
Okay, so these are anecdotal reports to you?
Yeah, I hate to put it that way, but yeah. I mean, I would say fairly reliable.
Okay.
If there's nothing else, committee of the whole is tomorrow at 11 and followed by the legislative meeting. Thank you all very much.